Catch and shut the disassembly jack to release the bearings. Remove the bearing retainer. Turn the horizontal shaft counterclockwise and remove the key from the friction pulley. Release collar 1. This completes normal maintenance. However, if you wish to replace the horizontal shaft and gear boss, support the gear boss with a pipe or similar item and place a wooden slat against the friction pulley of the horizontal shaft, then tap lightly to release the gear boss. This completes the disassembly of the horizontal shaft. Clean and inspect the parts and replace parts as necessary. This is the procedure for assembling the horizontal shaft. Mount the gear boss on the horizontal shaft. Set the gear boss under the mounting part of the spiral gear like this and set the pipe. Apply lubricant to the engagement part of the horizontal shaft and align with the key, then tap the horizontal shaft from the pump side. As when releasing the horizontal shaft, be sure to use a wooden slat. When the gear boss is completely mounted on the horizontal shaft, set the horizontal shaft in a vise. Insert the bearing retainer, then mount the bearings. If the bearings do not mount smoothly, tap them lightly with a chisel. When the bearings have completely cooled, lightly tap the inner rims of the bearings to confirm that they are mounted completely. Mount collar 2. Set the retainer ring C. Turn the horizontal shaft counterclockwise and confirm that the bearings are completely mounted. Mount the bearings. If the bearings do not mount smoothly, tap them lightly with a chisel. When collar 1 is mounted, tap the key with a plastic hammer. Align the spiral gear with the gear boss of the bolt hole and tap it in evenly with a plastic hammer. Fasten with the spring washers and bolts. After the key is mounted, check the engagement with the friction pulley. This completes the assembly of the horizontal shaft. This is the procedure for disassembling the gear pump. Remove the 4 socket cap screws that fasten the valve case. Remove the valve case by lightly tapping it with a hammer. Remove the bushings of the drive gear and driven gear. If these are difficult to remove, tap in a counterclockwise direction with a plastic hammer. The bushings should release smoothly. Release the drive gear and driven gear. Remove the gear bushing from the pump housing. If the gear bushings remain mounted on the shafts of the drive gear and driven gear, they may fall off the shaft. Harden the lip of the oil seal, inspect for damage, and perform replacements as necessary. Remove the retaining ring fastening the oil seal with a pair of ring pliers. From the insertion part of the gear bushing, strike the oil seal with a screwdriver to remove it. When doing this, be careful not to damage the insertion part of the bushing. Remove the cap nut. If the adjusting screw needs to be removed, be sure to check the position of the adjusting screw before disassembly. Remove the nut, then the adjusting screw. Loosen the adjusting screw, then remove the valve spring and valve stem. This completes the disassembly of the gear pump. Clean and inspect the parts and replace parts as necessary. This is the procedure for assembly of the gear pump. Mount the valve stem and valve spring. When the adjusting screw is disassembled, be sure to place the adjusting screw at its position before disassembly. Do not tighten the adjusting screw excessively, as this can increase the running pressure. Similarly, do not leave the adjusting screw too loose, as this can cause insufficient air intake. Set the regulation pressure to 0.4 megapascals. Mount the oil seal using a patch and chisel. Set the retaining ring. Mount the gear bushing on the pump housing. Apply lubricant on the insertion part of the gear bushing. At this point, mount the bushing with the oil grooves on the edge surface facing up. Mount the drive gear and driven gear. When mounting the drive gear, take care not to damage the oil seal. Mount the bushing on the pump housing. Mount the bushing with the oil grooves on the flat surface facing down. Mount the O-ring on the pump housing and mount the pump housing. Tighten the 4 socket cap screws uniformly. Finally, check by hand that the drive gear turns. This completes the assembly of the gear pump. Harden the lips of the oil seals mounted on the small bearing housing and the large bearing housing. Inspect them for damage and replace if necessary. This completes the disassembly, cleaning, inspection, and assembly of all of the parts removed from the purifier. We will now explain the procedure for mounting each part on the selfejector. This is the procedure for mounting the vertical shaft and related parts. The vertical shaft must be mounted before the horizontal shaft. If the horizontal shaft is mounted first, the angular bearing case of the vertical shaft will be placed in contact with the spiral gear, preventing assembly of the vertical shaft. Mount the lower spring. Set the steel ball on the spring seat to mount it. To mount the vertical shaft, align the keys mounted on the lower bearing case of the vertical shaft with a key groove on the lower bearing housing. With the vertical shaft free, mount the horizontal shaft. Apply grease to the lip of the oil seal mounted on the small bearing housing, taking care not to damage it, and mount the horizontal shaft. Align the keys of the upper bearing case with the key grooves on the upper bearing sleeve to mount the horizontal shaft. Check that the upper bearing housing is firmly mounted. Mount spacers on the upper bearing case, then mount the upper bearing case, taking care to align the flat springs correctly top and bottom. Measure the gap between the upper bearing housing and flat springs. The tolerance for this gap vary according to the model, so please consult your user's manual. If the measured gap is not within the tolerance, select the appropriate spacers and insert them to ensure that the gap is within the tolerance. Two types of spacers are supplied, 0.5 millimeters and 1.0 millimeter. Check that the gap between the upper bearing housing and flat spring is within the tolerance, then temporarily remove the upper bearing housing and set the O-ring. Apply grease to the O-ring groove before setting the O-ring. This prevents the O-ring from falling out. Align the keys mounted on the upper bearing case with the key groove on the upper bearing sleeve. At the same time, align the retaining bolts of the upper bearing housing. Insert spacers on the upper bearing case to the appropriate thickness, then set the flat spring. Mount the O-ring on the upper bearing housing, then mount upper bearing cap 2 and the upper bearing cover. Tighten the 3 bolts uniformly to fasten. Mount upper bearing cap 1, then mount the mist cover. This is the procedure for mounting the water supplying device. Mount the vertical shaft on the water supplying device. Fasten the 3 socket cap screws, then tighten the cap nuts on the operating water tube completely. Check that the water supplying device is set firmly, then tighten the socket set screws on the chamber cover to fasten them to the vertical shaft. This completes the assembly of the vertical shaft system. This is the procedure for assembling the horizontal shaft. Mount the O-ring on the large bearing housing, then mount it on the horizontal shaft. At this point, apply grease to the oil seal, taking care not to damage the oil seal. Tighten the retaining bolts on the large bearing housing. Align the bolt holes on the large bearing housing with the bearing retainer and tighten. Mount the large bearing housing and small bearing housing with the oil grooves facing down. Mount the friction pulley. Align the keys on the horizontal shaft with the key grooves on the friction pulley and mount the horizontal shaft. At this point, check that the friction pulley is flush with the horizontal shaft collars. Mount the lock washer and lock nut, then turn the lock washer to fasten it. Mount the friction blocks on the friction boss using a rubber band like this. The number of friction blocks used varies according to the model and the frequency. Mount the appropriate number of friction blocks. If oil is found on the inner surface of the friction pulley and the outer surface of the friction block, wipe it away and dry it before mounting the motor. Lift the motor using the chain block and mount it on the self-ejector, then fasten it with the bolts. Reconnect the motor, referring to the notes you took earlier. Mount the sheet packing on the drain plug and tighten. Insert the rated amount of lubricant in the gearbox and mount the gear cover. This is the procedure for mounting the gear pump. Fasten the gear pump, then align the gear pump shaft with the safety joint engagement of the horizontal shaft. Mount the safety joint. Connect the connecting tubes. After assembly, start the instant starter and check the direction of rotation. This completes the assembly of the entire Mitsubishi Selfejector G series. Let's look at the sludge discharge process using an actual example of total discharge. In this example, all of the sludge inside the bowl is discharged from the sludge discharge holes. In automatic operation, at preset sludge discharge intervals, the supply of dirty oil is stopped and the replacement water is supplied to the separation chamber, thus collecting the oil in the bowl. Next, operating water is supplied to the water pressure room. Once the chamber is filled, centrifugal force is applied to generate hydraulic pressure in the operating water. When this hydraulic pressure exceeds the centrifugal force in the hydraulic valve, the pilot valves move inward. As you can see, the operating water in the valve opening chamber is then discharged from the bowl. When the operating water in the valve opening chamber is discharged, the hydraulic pressure inside the separation chamber causes the valve cylinder to slide downward. The dropping of the valve cylinder causes the sludge discharge outlet to open, and all sludge and liquids are immediately discharged from the separation chamber. When discharge ends, the supply of valve opening water stops. All of the valve opening water is released through the drain nozzles. With the hydraulic pressure from the valve opening water removed, the pilot valves once again move outside. The supply of the valve opening water, which had been stopped during sludge discharge, is now resumed. When the bowl is filled with the valve opening water, hydraulic pressure is generated, pushing the valve cylinder upward to shut the discharge outlet. Sealing water is supplied into the separation chamber, and dirty oil operation begins.